Write Night is a talk show with published authors, writers, and content creators discussing both the creative and technical sides of writing, as well as the industry surrounding it, from novels to screenplays to comics and more. And now, here's your host, author Travis I. Sivart.
Hello and welcome to Write Night. I am Travis Sivart, your host and author of series such as Portals and Silver and Smith, and I invite you to check them out. Just find me on Amazon or just Google me. Tonight's topic is going to be inclusivity, but first let's let these awesome people we're hanging out with introduce themselves. Robert, can we start with you, please?
Sure. I am Robert Turk, author and game designer and professional goblin retired. You can find me and my award-winning books and games at wicked-clever.com.
And Tara?
And I am Tara Moeller, author, editor, and dreamer-in-chief at dreampunkpress.com, which is where you can find us. And if you really want to find out just what I read, what I write, what I think, you can visit my blog at www.taramoeller.com.
And Robert, the crowd is going wild over your shirt, by the way, just so you know.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's one of my... oh, wait, which one? The one with the droids on it? Because I'm a huge Star Wars fan, especially for the droids, or the Hawaiian shirt, the blue?
I feel like I should wear my Hawaiian shirt that's exactly like that one. Okay, now a little bit about you guys who are listening to this. For the podcast folks who are listening on podcasts, we do have a live and interactive chat audience that we talk to, answer questions from, or read their comments. So if you hear this noise, that means I want to read some comments off, though we'll probably just include them without having to ding the bell most of the time. For those of you in chat, please understand we are recording the podcast right now, which means we might not respond and get to all your comments or questions. But we will get to most of them, especially the ones that are relevant and or entertaining to ourselves. So, Tara, Robert, if you're watching chat and there's something I'm not hitting that you want to talk about, make sure you pull that up. I don't have any problem with that. Now, the topic itself is inclusivity. This is something we're all very passionate about. We don't necessarily walk around stomping and screaming it in the air, but I'm one of those guys. Anytime I'm at an event or a convention and you get that little gathering of group of people in the hall or outside and you see that one person standing off to one side kind of listening, I'll tell the people I'm talking to, make a little room, and I'll wave that person forward. I say, come on in. You can talk if you want to, or you can just listen, but you don't need to stand over there to do it. Come on over here. And this is the first step in my mind. There we go. Tejinter has defined it very well. This is why he's a moderator. But inclusivity has grown so much over the past 3 to 5 years. It has expanded in ways that we couldn't have predicted. The world has very much changed over the past few years. And it's... There's a good question from Andrew. Andrew, we'll get to that in a few moments, so bear with us while we let everybody throw their opening thoughts in, and then we're definitely going to address that. That's a great question. So, Robert, you got some opening thoughts on this topic?
I do have some opening thoughts on this topic. So, most recently, and what I'm probably more well known for than my novels and middle grade books and short stories is writing role-playing games. Mm-hmm. And role-playing as an industry is very much dominated by middle-aged white men with beards and goatees, surprisingly. And maybe that's just middle-aged white men have beards and goatees. And this is a constant struggle in my industry, not only to find the voices that are out there of BIPOC people, of female designers and writers and artists, just to be aware of those people in the industry, but elevate them so that their voices have equal importance as the the male dominated industry, because it's very hard, even when you get 20 guys who are all shouting their thing. If you've only got one female designer in that group, nobody's ever going to hear her. So it's hard, and it's, as a business, as a publishing company, this is something that actually I realized when I went to do my second game on Kickstarter. My wife pointed out, she goes, hey, the pictures of everybody involved in this project, all the artists, the editors, me, the designer, and publisher, were middle-aged white guys with goatees. She says, everybody on your team looks exactly the same. Why even put pictures up if you're all just the same guy in different bodies? And when she pointed that out, I realized that I was perpetuating the issue at hand, and actually made it a point to seek out, because I didn't know any female sci-fi artists, and that was what we were doing. I made it a point to make myself aware of female sci-fi artists so that I could hire some that were good. You still had to be good. You still had to be top-notch art, but bring them into the project. And that has gone further on every project I've worked on since then, is making sure that in order to be inclusive for the audience, I am representative in my company.
Tara?
That's my opening thoughts.
So the most basic to me of inclusivity is language. I'm an editor, and so a lot of times when I'm editing, there's an inclusivity aspect. And so being an editor, when you automatically read critically, even just newspaper articles, you tend to notice some things. And I follow some accounts on Twitter of folks who are non-binary, trans, and anywhere else on that spectrum of LGBTQIA2S+. And some of the most basic of fights, disputes, debates, whatever you want to call it, it will be over language. One of the most basic is the use of their as a singular pronoun. And as I have a kid who uses that pronoun, I get into it with folks, and I've gotten into it with folks at work. Luckily, my colonel backs me up. But that is the most basic way to include people. We talk, we speak, we write, is to be aware of the language that we use. And one of the most basic forms is, if somebody says, this is my pronoun, try to use it. And then it goes beyond that. The next steps are things like, I have seen, debates on Twitter about the term people with uteruses instead of using the term women. And considering I am a woman who no longer has a uterus, I have no problem with that. I don't think I ever had a problem. I was taken aback the first time I saw it used and went, wow, that's great, because it includes everybody. And there's a lot of folks who feel that that is erasing the identity of women. And so there is a balance between being inclusive and then being exclusive, where you're excluding because someone feels like suddenly you're just lumping people into a big group of whatever. And so in a lot of ways, it's a balancing act that we have to recognize and be respectful of, that there's feelings on both sides. And feelings are always valid, no matter what side you're on, because there are some, Monday was International Women's Day, and women, cishet women, have struggled for centuries to be recognized as people in some ways. And so for that recognition, some feel that when you don't use the term woman, that you are excluding them. And so there's stuff on both sides. And so it's not an easy topic, and it's not something you can just say, oh, we're going to be inclusive, and that's the end of it, because there are some who feel when you're being inclusive by creating this big group that includes more and more and more people, that they're losing an individual identity.
Yeah.
My opening thoughts here is I feel there's two types of inclusive. There is inclusive with groups, and there's inclusive with individuals. I am definitely very inclusive with individuals. I'm inclusive with groups also, but that individual, when I'm dealing with people one-on-one, I want to be able to have that person be who they are, however they identify, whatever labels they choose to accept, reject, claim, hang on to, toss away and sneer at. That's fine. But when we're talking face-to-face or interacting in whatever way, I want everybody to be accepted and be able to have the conversation first and foremost. Where it goes from there. Now, as for the groups, this is something that relates to, Andrea threw a question in the chat. As a writer, do you feel you need to include a representation of everyone? And also to Jinter threw in the thought, to be inclusive, but to do it without ostracizing your current fan base is hard to do. And I want to address that before I move on.
Sure.
If you're including others, it shouldn't ostracize anyone. It should expand your group, not contract it. And if your audience has a problem with you bringing in somebody who is different from them, maybe it's okay to lose part of your audience. Because
Amen.
You're not cutting out however your fan base identifies. You're expanding how your fan base identifies. Or perhaps erasing the lines between identifiers without cutting out individuality. That individuality is very important to me. And I'm going to keep on throwing that disclaimer after everything I say because, as Tara said, it's a balance. It's a back and forth. And in the past handful of years, oh my goodness, this stuff has changed and flexed and grown and exploded and imploded and come to blows and arguments and agreements and love, and it's been the worst chili cook-off ever that everybody walks away going, we should do that again.
Yeah, because we're not there yet.
No, and I hope our species one day can be. But yes, Robert, you had some thoughts.
Yeah. So the representation of everyone, I find as an artist that I have to speak the truth that I know, that I have to write to make it authentic from my experience or things that I can research. So me personally would never write a novel or a story from the perspective of, let's say, a black man, or even, let's take it a step further, let's say a black woman. It would be inauthentic. I would be, in my mind, I would be insulting the people that I would want to reach with that by assuming an identity that's not my own. It's sort of like the whole cultural appropriation thing. I have to write what I know. I have to speak my truth, but there are ways to do it as an author to be inclusive. In my book that I wrote for middle grade readers, my lead character, Persnickety Jones, is a girl, okay? But I never
Good name,
say...
by the way.
Thank you. I love that name. Persnickety Jones and the Pirates of... the title.
Pirates
I never
of what?
say Pirates of Undertow.
Okay, go on. It skipped out for a second. Sorry.
That's okay. I never say what color her hair is. I never say what color her skin is. And I did that on purpose because I wanted every little kid that read that book to be able to see themselves in the character. So I don't put those superficial physical details on this character. I describe other characters in the world, like Salty Dog. I tell you he's got like the pattern on his fur and all that, because you might see yourself in the dog character, but at a deep level, a kid's not going to say, oh, I'm the dog. No, they're going to say, I'm persnickety. And so that in their head, they can imagine the character however they want to imagine it. And I think that little step right there can go a great way towards being inclusive by not being exclusive, by not saying this is a Caucasian girl with red hair and freckles who lives in a family with 3.5 kids and her parents make X dollars a year. You are opening it up to include other people by not excluding them.
May I respond to something he said before we pass it to you, Tara?
Yes.
As a writer, when it comes to writing people who aren't white males, I have black characters, I have female characters, matter of fact, Tara, as my editor, has asked me, is this person LGBTQIA? Is this person? And I'm like, it doesn't matter, because I did like you, I left it open. It's not part of the story, so I want the reader to be able to put themselves in. But I feel as a writer, writing somebody who is a different background than you, it's that empathy writers have. And your research is getting to know other people in the real world so you can tell part of their story. Yes, Andrea, Hank, exactly. So I understand what you're saying, and I agree with what you're saying, but I haven't stuck to that. But there are certain characters I'm like, I don't think I'm ready to write that. And largely that's because our society hasn't settled that conversation yet. And it's changing from day to day, month to month, and year to year. So I'm not comfortable writing that point of view when we're still developing that point of view and that experience. And when I do write about that experience, I want it to be inclusive in the sense that they're a part of our society. They're not somebody different. They're another person.
Right.
Excuse me.
Right. I think I should clarify that I could not write the protagonist. I could not write the central character as something very different than me. My books are not filled with straight white guys. That's not the only characters that appear in my books.
That's a different kind of party.
Because that would be boring and not inclusive at all.
That's politics.
Right.
Tara, do you have some thoughts on this before we just dominate the conversation here?
You're going to let me get my 30% of the conversation?
Tara, you know you'll take more. Go.
I know. So, and this is kind of, what I went with when I did my initial thoughts on this. At a conference I was at last week online, there were a couple of different presentations about diversity and inclusion. And there were a couple of different takes. And some of the big things between the two that I think help most, and from people of color and Latinos, etc., that I follow on Twitter. I follow a lot of writers, female writers, some male, on Twitter. When we've discussed things like this, the big thing about if you're going to write a character who is not like you, skin color, ethnicity, etc., culture, is what story are you telling? For Travis's books, for the Portals stuff, he is taking these characters and he's dropping them in a fantastical world. He is not, for his Black characters, he is not telling a Black story. This takes to the idea of own voices, where if you are telling a specific story, I'm going to mention American Dirt. Are you familiar with that book?
No, not at all.
And the controversy. It is the story of a Latina woman crossing the border, immigrating into this country, and the getting across the border and whatever, and it was written by a white woman. So she is telling a story that, and she, and her um, defense of it is that, well, she did research and she spoke to people, but that was not a story for a white person to tell. Certainly not a white person who
Right.
never was poor. There's a whole lot more, but to write a story of a Latina woman in a fantasy world, that's different. That is being inclusive. But to tell a story like that of an experience that only a Latina woman illegally crossing a border in order to get away from, the danger in her home country, that's a story that needs to be told by someone who has actually experienced it. The same if we want to talk about, there's a story about a young Black person who watched. I'm going to talk about the book, The Hate You Give. Which was written by a young Black woman, very, very well. And that was an appropriate story because she lived it, she saw it. And so there's an authenticity there that is absent from. There's no pity. There's empathy, but no pity, if you know what I mean. There's an authenticity. And I think as a writer, we can be inclusive. When I write, I try to write from a perspective that I understand. I will write a male character, and they're probably white, but their friend might be Latino, or Black, or gay. And so there's a way that you can write that if you're not telling the angst and the pain, what I write is as E.G. Gaddis, I write stories, and I have a lot of LGBT characters in there, but the stories aren't about them being LGBT.
That's something, yeah. When I'm writing the Black character, Latino character in these books, I'm telling a human story. I'm not telling an ethnic story. I'm not telling a journey that, though I've discussed it with many people, some people would definitely say, oh, you've talked about it enough, you can get it. And other people say, no, you'll never understand. A couple comments here, by the way. Andrea did say, Robert, that's a great technique in regards to what you said. Tijen says, I don't fully disagree, but my current book, by the way, Tijen, in case anybody doesn't know, is of Asian descent. Says, I don't fully disagree, but my current book is written from a white American perspective, born and raised here, but I have never been that. I'm not stealing from them or pretending to be. Another comment. Let me read all these, and then please, Robert, jump in.
Sure.
Tejinter, in reference to something we said earlier, so as long as you aren't stereotyping or being a cardboard cutout when you're creating these characters in your stories, it's which I've used stereotypes, but usually it's for a third-tier character because a stereotype's a very easy way to just introduce this conflict or this thing. But usually it's not ethic. Andrea asked earlier on, and then Robert, I'm giving you the floor to respond, and then we can go back to this question just before it goes too far up. Do you think it has gone from authenticity to gender that is more important to be inclusive? And then also we could go back to her previous question about the do you feel the need to include a representation of everyone? Which I do not. I include what the story needs.
Exactly what the story needs.
Okay, Robert, you had thoughts. Please go.
So I don't see any problem at all with Tejinter not being a white American writing about white Americans. White Americans, at least in America, are dominant. And it goes back to, I think it was Terry Pratchett, but I could be wrong on who said this. But it's basically, if you're poking fun at the dominant force in a society, That's funny. That's good. That needs to be done. If you're poking fun at the minorities, the oppressed in a society, that's bullying. And that doesn't need to be done. So writing a story about a white American, absolutely. But taking that a little bit further, yes, there are stories that need to be told. Going to one of the other comments here, there are stories that do absolutely need to be told. However, as white people, as white men especially, if we tell those stories, no matter how well we tell those stories, the unintended consequence is that we are silencing the other voices that can and should be telling those stories. We are taking the air out of the room and not allowing those people to step forward and tell those stories. So by white people, by white men just shutting up and not throwing our hat into that ring, we leave the space for other authors of color, female authors, LGBTQ authors, other people to speak their truth. And it doesn't matter how skillfully we write it, it will always be a better story when it's told from the perspective of the people that it actually matters to, and they have actually lived through those experiences.
Tara, you've been nodding a lot, and I know you've got some thoughts here.
Yeah, there's universal stories and universal experiences. And then there's the very specific ones. And part of the problem the publishing industry has right now, and you're not going to see this with self-published authors because they're publishing themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. But what I see in the discussions that I have listened to about inclusivity is that a lot of publishing houses are like, we already have our Black author. We don't just need one. Or, we already have that story. So we're not gonna, and the story they're publishing was not by an appropriate author to be telling the story.
Yeah.
And then you will have the problem where in publishing you have white editor of either gender. And when a manuscript is submitted by a Black author, it's written differently. The language is different.
Yeah.
And so they will over edit the language in it, which takes away authenticity. And Black stories, Asian stories, Latina stories, there is a language in them that is very different from the language that the majority of white people in this country speak. And a lot of times in publishing, when you're a white editor, you don't recognize that. The cadence is different. The word choice is different. Right now, I started rereading God's Mountain by Midori Bamba. Midori is a friend of mine who passed away last year. And I'm rereading this, and I remember the first time I read it was Midori gave me a gift. We met at a writing conference, and she gave it to me. It was her first novel. She was Japanese. Married a man in the military, came over here, so she was born in Otaku. And when I first read that book, I was like, oh my gosh, it's horrible. It needed to be edited. I'm an editor. Now I have known Midori I had known her for almost 20 years at this point in time. She passed away last year, so we've known each other for almost 2 decades. So I'm rereading this book. Well, now having known her more, fully recognized that English is her second language, was her second language, that she was born in Japan, raised in Japan. And and I know I have more friends now of Japanese descent or who came from Japan, married a military person. And having those conversations and recognizing more of the language differences, when I'm reading this now, I am recognizing that that is the Japanese cadence translated into English. Where if I had been Midori's editor 20 years ago for that, I would have destroyed that novel.
Yeah.
And the publishing editors have to recognize that yes, there's a, we talk, editors and publishers and talking about, an authentic voice, your voice. But then a white editor edits that out so much. And so the publishing industry needs Black editors, Asian editors. And when I say Asian, I don't mean Asian. I mean, they need a Korean editor, they need a Japanese editor, they need a Chinese editor, they need someone from India. Because, we blanket Asian.
Right, we do.
Okay, there's a lot of difference in Asian. If you wanted to try to lump somebody from Korea and somebody in Japan and say they're the same, that's like saying that, somebody from down East Maine, which is about as close for me, and somebody from Savannah, Georgia, are going to have the same take on things. And we don't.
That's fair.
And while we recognize that here, we over inclusive and saying, they're all Asian. And that's what I mean by there's a balance where there's a time when you're, including everybody, but then recognizing the individual.
If I can go to chat real quick.
Yeah.
Andrea says the same can be seen in cinema. Japanese differs from American horror because of the cultural differences. And I want to return back to her question and bring it back up. Do you think it has gone from damn it, Travis, ethnic to gender that is more important to be inclusive? And I'm going to open this thought up with, it is in the attention of our culture right now. So it's important to be addressed and to be recognized. And hopefully down the road, things will blend in. But then again, a woman's voice is still different from a man's voice for multiple reasons, obvious reasons, but also because there's not an equality there yet. And I recently did some research on how many U.S. senators are female historically throughout all of our U.S. history. How many are Black? How many are Latino? How many are Native American? How many are Asian? It is sad numbers. Not like a little askew, way skewed. Like in the single digits a lot of times. Scary skewed. So, Tara, I kind of want to hand this one to you because a lot of your focus is on LGBTQIA+. But I'm going to read to Ginger's comment real quick. For the love that all is holy, please don't have a Chinese guy to edit my book. I'd rather have an American white guy that knows when to leave something alone. And that's a gift of an editor that comes with experience, is when to leave it alone. When Tara first edited my book, she's like, I'm leaving this because it's your voice. As an editor, I want to fix it, but this is the voice of the writer, and I'm not changing it. But back to Andrea's question, because this is so important in our world, our culture right now. Let's talk about the gender versus ethnic.
5 years ago, when it was the, I just read something, the club in Florida, the gay club. And the guy went in and shut everything. That was in the forefront. And so we were focused on LGBT. And last year, not just George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, so many others. I mean, the list could go on. Our focus is on skin color and Black people. And, February was Black History Month. And I watched and read a lot of commentary. It's Black History Month, Black History Month. And folks of Asian descent are coming in because with the pandemic, they were also trying to highlight that stuff was happening to them because our administration for the last year, our last administration, wanted to call it the Chinese virus. And again, in this country, we take a look and we see someone that is vaguely Asian and we equate them with being Chinese, which they could be Japanese or Korean or Vietnamese. And they are all very different.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what happens is something grabs all of our attention, whether it is something that happens to someone because of their skin color, and then, and for a while that is a focus, and we focus and we don't get anything fixed because something happens to somebody because of their ethnicity. And suddenly we're trying to fix that. And then something happens to LGBT. And then, and suddenly we're focused on that.
We're putting out fires.
And we're not,
Yes.
and we're not even putting out fires. We're just getting the flames down to something that may be manageable.
Well, that's what I'm saying. When you're putting out a fire, you're handling what's in front of you right then, as opposed to addressing the cause. You're addressing the effect.
Right.
The symptom instead of the disease.
Right.
Yep.
And it's, depends on the month, because it depends on what part of history we're trying to focus on. Instead of looking at it and going, it's all American history, we need to focus on it all the time. And by that, I mean Black history, Asian history coming to, from Japanese coming and Chinese immigration, to, June and Pride Month, and what, the history of the LGBT community. All of that is American history. And I know I will tweet and I will put on my LinkedIn and I will tweet and I will say, Black, hashtag Black history is hashtag American history. Hashtag LGBT history is hashtag American history. Because until we look at it as a whole, we're going to be putting out fires. And on the one hand, it's the one little thing. And on the other hand, it's the big thing.
So let me redirect us as we're coming up closer to the end of the episode here. How do we, as artists, as creators of books, of games, of everything we do, how do we create this inclusivity? And I'm going to say, for my shows here, Talk of the Tavern in specific is one of my other podcasts, I have included LGBTQIA co-hosts, Black, Asian, Latino. I have women, Jewish. I have attempted to include much more than, as Robert pointed out in the beginning, white middle-aged men, whatever their facial hair is. Because it's important to me to not have carbon copies of me sitting here all nodding and agreeing. Now, we can all nod and agree, but let's at least have different backgrounds and points of view when we come to that consensus and agreement. And Robert was shaking his head in the beginning and saying no, and then nodding once I added that end on there. And I say that because of the podcast, they can't see that, Robert, and I want them to know that you guys are also going, yeah, that's not right. Yes, that's right. So what are your thoughts on how do we do this as artists, as creators?
I feel like I've gone first. I want to.
Okay. I think we need to be sensitive. We need to think about what we are writing, what we are drawing, what we're bringing into conversations, the language that we use. And if we are, then we will be attuning ourselves to our specific environment at the time, and then the broader environment. And if we are being sensitive and respectful to that, when we go to write, we start thinking, what is the story that I'm telling? Is it an appropriate story for me to tell? I know that there are authors who are like, That's for the publishing industry to figure out.
Mm-mm.
I'm going to write my story, and then, they can decide. And it's like, no, there is an individual responsibility. That said, there is also responsibility by the publishing industry, by the art industry, by the movie industry, that they have to take some responsibility as well. And like I said, I think if everybody puts forth some effort to be sensitive, and as an author, there's such thing as sensitivity readers that we can find and pay to read our books and help us make sure that we are being sensitive to these aspects of what we are doing. Do no harm. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you don't want somebody else telling your story, why do you want to tell somebody else?
Robert?
Yeah. So I think that one of the biggest things that we can do as creatives is be aware that our personal experience is not the universal experience. We are one person with one point of view. We have preconceived biases. We have privileges in different aspects. And to be aware of those and recognize it's not a bad thing to have those notions, to have the experience you have had, but it's not a universal experience. And so open yourself up to other voices, to the fact that other people think and look and act differently, and give strength to their voice. I want to pull one project, which is the role-playing game I did, Weird Scouts. And it so happened that everybody art-wise that worked on this project was a female artist. But when the first concept sketches were turned in, like, that's in the role-playing industry, that's huge. Everybody that worked on this book from an art standpoint, and there were 5 artists, they were all females. Not a single male did any illustrations for this book. But when all the sketches were turned in, there was a distinctly white European look.
I remember you addressing this when it happened.
Of the book, and so I had to go back to the artist and I said, look, folks, this is for families, this is for kids. I want any kid to pick up this book and be able to see themselves in the book. And if everybody is a white European, then we don't get that. And the artist turned back to me and said, oh my God, you mean we can give people actual skin tones? And I said, yes, give them skin tones. And I mean, give me some, there's not any specific trans characters that you would point to and say, oh, that's trans, because that would be a very stereotypical, we'd have to exaggerate. But I said, give me some alternatives to, let me see everybody in this book. So we've clearly, it's not in your face because it's for kids and family, but there's clearly a lesbian romance in one of these illustrations. There's a dryad and a mermaid that are clearly in love. You see it in their eyes, and one of them's offering a gift. There are Asian kids in here. There are African American kids in here. There are, we pushed it to make sure that we weren't just putting out white European fantasy. And if I had not been aware of that tendency, of that privilege, of that trend to put everything out there that looks like me and looks like what I grew up on and looks like the norm for a fantasy role-playing game, if I as a person, as an artist, as a company, didn't make the effort to be aware of that and push back against that, I would have had a book in the end that was the same as everything else out there.
That's something I did in My Puppy as a Werewolf. The main child character, when I went to the artist, who's a black female artist, I said, I want him to be indeterminate ethnic background. I want Hispanics and Latinos. I want Indian people. I want everybody to be able to look at this Middle Eastern and go, that could be me. That could be my kid. That could be somebody I know. Now, it could absolutely be a white kid, too. It could be a well-tanned white kid. We don't know, and it doesn't matter, and it shouldn't matter. Something I'll say, adding on to what you guys said, is to put it concisely, make the conversation, not the confrontation. Don't sit there and complain about what's going on. Tajin in the chat mentioned people like to go and stare at the fires instead of putting them out and go, oh, that's horrible, I'll pray and click like. Make the conversation, not the confrontation. Open up the dialogue and listen. Even if it means you don't get to put your 2 cents in, this is important to educate yourself, to give the other people voice. And at some point in time, you will get to voice your thoughts. But right now, maybe not the time. This is that sensitivity part that Tara was talking about. And I'm going to take one last question, comment here. I was ready to wrap up the show, but I feel it's very worth addressing, hopefully in brief. I know none of us are terribly brief, but we'll try. Andrea says, do you think writing of the past where certain things were okay, should that be deleted or acknowledged and learned from? And then she also says, met a comic creator that had a superhero with a prosthetic. That is something you don't see much. And then Tajinter says, here's a point. I don't have very many South Korean, because he's from South Korea, hero books. They exist, but we aren't represented. So if you decide to write a Korean hero in a book, that'll be okay. But if you just sit there and say, I won't write this because I don't represent him, then we don't get represented sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so
I hear that.
Should the past, where certain horrible things, and hell, we still do it right now today, should that be ignored, erased, removed, deleted, or should it be acknowledged and learned from? And this is one of those fine line things. Which one of you want to go first?
I'll go first.
Go ahead, Tara.
So I have a short story that I wrote, a prequel to Mechanics of Life. And when I wrote it, I had no problem. It is written from the point of view of a young Black girl. Now, it's in a fantasy world, steampunk, alternate universe. It has a lot of problems in it. And I have not pulled it down yet. One, it's in an anthology. I can't pull it down because I did one that I did not publish. But I own it in that if someone reads it and calls me out, I go, you are so right. I write nothing. In fact, I have a book that I was writing, and when I realized I don't know that I can write this character, so it's going to be written from a different perspective. It's a little love story with, so I'm going to write it from the other character's point of view instead of the character that it first came to me as, because I'm not comfortable in writing from that perspective. I think it is on the author or on the organization currently responsible for the work to be sensitive about what is out there and what they have put out there. And yes, I'm specifically talking about the Dr. Seuss books right now.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of folks who are up in arms about that, about we're canceling Dr. Seuss. The Dr. Seuss organization decided that they are particular books for children that they have decided they don't want to publish anymore. They're not going out buying them up out of libraries and destroying the ones that are already out there. They simply have decided that there are things in those books that are children's books that are being read to children. Parents aren't discussing that. So they're taking the sensitive and responsible thing. If it is a book that was written by an adult 100 years ago, and it is being read by adults today, then I think it is on the reader to be sensitive to what they're reading and think about it. Children, young children, They're not critical thinkers yet. You read something to them in a book, hey, it's there. They're going to accept it. They're going to take it at face value, unless the parent is going to go deeper. And a lot of white parents did not even recognize what was in those books.
Now, a lot of those books are not even really sold anymore. They're not the popular Dr. Seuss books.
Yes.
They're not. I had never read any of these to my kids. And when you look at the illustrations, it's pretty clear that these are offensive. And if you get a kid in the library taking down one of these historic Dr. Seuss books that nobody pulls out to read and looking at those pictures and saying, oh, well, this is what people think about me. No, it's okay to just let's take those. We're not erasing them from history. We're just saying, you know what? I'm not saying it. The publisher is saying, you know what? Those books are out there. We acknowledge it. We're not printing any more of those. We're not going to continue to put those books out there.
I actually, when it first happened and Disney and other companies started putting disclaimers on certain shows or movies, Andrea just mentioned Fantasia, Robert has pointed out certain episodes, The Muppet Show, they're not pulling them down, they're putting that disclaimer in front of it. And I think this is a great way to approach that, going, like Tara, you mentioned, you own it. You if somebody comes to you and says this, you're like, nope, you're right. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to say, I'm not going to defend. You're right. And I think horrible things have happened in human history, and they're still happening nowadays. But I think it's important to keep those in our perception so we can use them as glaring examples of we don't want that again. We want to understand this is why change is important. Now, we don't need to highlight them to our children as a standard because then it becomes accepted. But we want to use them as the highlight. Andrea says it should start a discussion, not a war. Again, conversation, not confrontation. And Kennedy says, I would want my grandson, who, from a mix of backgrounds, to be able to see himself in these characters. And I think that's very important, and that's how we, as artists, bring that inclusive future. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Tara, I see you raising a finger. You got a final thought here?
And I swear it's quick. Children's books are eternal. There are so many children's books that are still published today that are classics that are read and are used to teach our children. That's why I clarified the difference between a children's book and an adult book. Adult books, most people, you read Dracula maybe, if you can get through it. I can't get through it.
Me neither.
So I think there's differences there. And like you said, there's ways you can have conversations. And I just think that, especially when you're talking Dr. Seuss, there is so much better stuff because he evolved and he admitted it himself a little bit. And his books were better, that there are better representations in his books than the ones that they've said they're not going to actively publish anymore, which allows new books to come out that better represent ethnicity, culture, religions, and the respect for those in children's books. And that's all I want. There is a difference between children's books like yours, Travis,
Well, going back to this for representation, something a lot of readers don't realize as they're reading the book, because you have Dad and Daddy, in the end of the book you see the two characters together. And this is something I did not make it glaring. I did not make it obvious. I wanted it to be normal. So I didn't stand here and point neon signs at it going, look, I'm doing this. Because I wanted it to be inclusive. And a lot of times, when you point a finger and scream that it's inclusive, it makes it non-inclusive. Because you're like, look.
Yep.
And, as a white guy, I'm going to be inclusive by including people cultures, identities in my writing, but I'm going to write the human story, not try to tell a story that no matter how many times I've heard it from how many different people, I cannot identify with it. And the other way is something I do every day when I stream and I write. Anybody who comes in, I encourage them to write their stories. And Tara, I know you do that with Dreampunk Press. Robert, you with your gaming and your books, as you've pointed that out. Yeah, it's a matter of opening that circle and inviting that person standing outside to come stand in the circle, whether they decide to speak or not. It's what we opened with. That's what I'm going to close with. Let me go ahead and do this wrap up, guys. This is a great one. If you want to email us at WriteNightShow, that's WRITENIGHT, show@gmail.com, WriteNightShow@gmail.com. Let us know your thoughts on this topic. Or if you have a topic you'd like to hear us discuss, let me know. Drop it in there. Or if you just want to say happy birthday to someone or yourself, or send a little personal message, please feel free to do so. I want to thank everybody who jumped in the chat. To Jen, Kennedy, Andrea, who else am I missing up here that I'm not calling out right now? So sorry if I forgot you. I appreciate all you guys being a part of this. Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody that hosted the stream through bits, rated, bought merchandise, and all the other things you guys do to support this stream. Let's get on out of here, and we'll catch you on the next Write Night.
Thank you for joining author Travis I. Sivart and the other writers, content creators, and all-around amazing people for our discussion here on Write Night. Join us again soon, and until you do, make sure you create with passion, enjoy the journey, and remember, every night can be Write Night.